Okay, so starting off today's show, we will start the same way we start off every Monday edition here on the Zach Kroll Sports Podcast, and that is with my top 10 takeaways from the past week of college basketball action. So without further ado, let's get to it. Boys, hit the music. Here we go. Takeaway number 1. The Maryland Terrapins might just be an NCAA tournament team. And I've teased at this a couple times over previous shows, but I'll get into it for a little bit. I think Mark Turgeon deserves some credit compared to some of the other coaches in college basketball. And let me tell you why. Last year was the season for Maryland. And even if it was the season, it's not easy for me to say, oh, they were definitely going to make the Final Four considering their postseason history. But at the same time, if Maryland was ever going to make a deep run in March Madness, it was last year, and it was easy to tell why. With guys like Anthony Cowan and Jalen Smith, plus a lot of the guys that they have back on this year's squad, it would have been easy to say going into this year, okay, even though Maryland returns a lot, they do lose they do lose Jalen Smith, they do lose Anthony Cowan, and I never really believed in Mark Turgeon as a coach who could overachieve with teams. He's never shown me that before. This is a guy that has never beaten a top 25 team on the road until a couple years ago. It was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. But the point being is, out of all of the coaches, I think Mark Turgeon deserves some credit, as he is, for the first time since he's gotten to College Park, he is overachieving with this University of Maryland squad. I think he deserves a lot of credit. Shout out to Mark Turgeon and the Terps. Takeaway number 2. We'll stay in the Big Ten, and this is a coach I am pretty frustrated with, and that is Archie Miller and his Indiana Hoosiers. And regarding Archie Miller, one thing I will say is this. Indiana has had some moments throughout the season where I'll be willing to give Archie credit. They beat Iowa twice, and they had some other really good wins as well. They blew out Stanford early in the season. They blew out Providence early in the season. So Indiana has had some good wins. But at the same time, there are way too many issues that happen way too often that make me question, like, okay, is this process with Archie Miller at Indiana working out? Because let's face the facts, right? Indiana is a place that expects to win basketball games. I don't necessarily know if they're out here expecting Archie Miller to be a previous version of Bob Knight, but they brought Archie Miller in to win basketball games. And most importantly, they brought in Archie Miller to win basketball games that they should win. And the good thing about Indiana was on Thursday night, they had a nice win over Minnesota. That's a win that could really help their NCAA tournament causes. And instead, they follow it up by losing to Michigan State. And I mean, guys, Michigan State, really? The same Michigan State team that is one of the more disappointing teams in college basketball, the Michigan State team that only scored 37 points against Rutgers. You guys remember that? Well, that team went into Assembly Hall and beat Indiana. And when evaluating Archie Miller, it's more of the same one step forward, one step back process. And to be honest with you, if I was a Hoosier fan, I really wouldn't stand it. And I'm not saying he should be fired, but man, the more time goes on, if I'm an Indiana fan, the more frustrated I am starting to get with Archie Miller and his Hoosiers. Takeaway number 3. One of the more improved players in college basketball, not only from last season to this season, but since the beginning of this season and now, is David McCormick of Kansas. This dude is an absolute animal, and he showed that on Saturday against Texas Tech, really dominating that game with their physicality and athleticism. And I'll say this, I do think of all of the teams in college basketball, there could be an argument made that Kansas, yes, Kansas, the Jayhawks, could be a sleeper in this year's tournament. And let me tell you why. I never bought the hype of Kansas as this top 5, top 10 team, but I always did think they were top 10, top 15 good. And there's no denying there is some talent on this team, and there are some guys that could help Bill Self win basketball games. We know what Jalen Wilson could do when he has his good days. We know what Ochai Agbaji could do when he has his good days. We know what Christian Braun could do when he has his good days. And now that all of a sudden, David McCormick, former top 30 recruit, has been in college for a couple years now. All of a sudden, he is starting to come on, and I think if you're a fan of the Kansas Jayhawks, that is great news, because you have a chance to go into the Big 12 tournament finally with some momentum and some consistent play. And when you look at the upcoming schedule for Kansas, it's interesting. They end the season, listen to this, at Texas and home against Baylor. Those are two incredibly fascinating games, and I'm curious to see what Kansas looks like tomorrow against Texas, because they played at Phog Allen Fieldhouse earlier this season, and not only did Texas win, but they demolished Kansas. Also, the Horns have been struggling, so it's going to be a big game in the Big 12. Takeaway number 4. Eric Musselman and the Arkansas Razorbacks are a team to watch, and Arkansas is very quietly playing their best basketball of the season. Now, I'll admit, Arkansas did hit a little bit of a tough stretch in their schedule in the middle of SEC play. But the thing is, the games Arkansas lost weren't against bad teams, right? If you look at the Hogs' struggles in SEC play, they lost to Missouri, they lost to Tennessee, they lost to LSU, they lost to Alabama, they lost to Oklahoma State, but they have taken care of business really besides that. They have beaten Missouri on the road. They've beaten Kentucky on the road. They beat Mississippi State. They beat Ole Miss. They beat Vanderbilt. They beat Auburn. They beat Georgia. They have won some games here, and now Arkansas is going to close their season against Alabama on Wednesday night. That is going to be one heck of a game, and Arkansas, I think, besides Alabama, could have the argument of playing some of the best basketball in the SEC. I guess we could throw Kentucky into that conversation. We'll get into them later in the show, but between Moses Moody and the return of Justin Smith, and how about Devo Davis, my freshman, with 18 points against Florida the other night. And if you've been watching Arkansas basketball over the last couple weeks, you know just how impactful that guy could be. So I think when you look at this team, right, Arkansas, they could be a sleeper. I have them ranked 23rd in my top 25 right now. I think there's a good chance they could increase from now until the time we get to Selection Sunday, but they're playing some really good basketball. They've won 4 in a row, and they don't lose to bad teams. We'll see what they do their next 2 games. Home against Alabama, home against LSU. I can't wait. Those will be 2 very exciting games. Takeaway number 5. I'm sure you guys saw what Boston College did hiring their head coach, Jim Christian, and I'll admit, I don't love hiring someone with 4 weeks left in the season in the middle of the pandemic. But apparently Winston Tabbs announcing that he's going to transfer after breaking the team COVID protocol rules. I would think that ultimately that's what made Jim Christian and Boston College finally give in. We know that the athletic director hasn't really put him in the most ideal position to win as possible. Obviously, Jerome Robinson and Kai Bowman left, and I said that because when you look at Boston College's non-conference schedule this year, it was an absolute joke. They were helpless. They never had any chance of winning any of those basketball games to begin with, and I just think Boston College really let their coach, Jim Christian, out to dry here. However, I do think they have some options as for a new head coach. The first guy that comes to mind is John Beilein. We know what exactly this guy has done since he's been the head coach of University of Michigan, and he has done a phenomenal job as a college basketball coach, really, wherever he's been throughout his career. And really, anyone at this point could, I think, be an improvement over Jim Christian. Now, they could have maybe Ed Cooley, they could have John Becker from Vermont, maybe Phil Cohen from Northeastern. I think those are all realistic options, but the key for Boston College is giving whoever you hire as your next head coach a legitimate chance to succeed, because with that non-conference schedule and considering the fact that you're Boston College, a program that somehow, some way had 2 NBA kids in there with Robinson and Bowman, and unfortunately, you just let them get away. If I'm a BC fan, I'm not too happy with the way things have turned out as of late. Takeaway number 6. Of all of the disappointing teams in college basketball, and there's been a lot of them, low-key, one I want to talk about is Greg Gard and his Wisconsin Badgers. Because I'll admit, if I was a fan of the Badgers, I would not be too happy right now with where my team stands. It almost feels like to me that they're playing like they're too old. And I know that's crazy to say because I'm always the guy that says experience is key, experience is key, experience is key. But I watched Wisconsin against Michigan. I watched Wisconsin against Iowa. And in the game against Iowa, like, they weren't competitive. You never really thought for a second that Wisconsin was ever going to win that basketball game. And considering the fact that there are going to be a lot of guys moving on from this Wisconsin program after this year, and I know everyone technically has that free year of eligibility left, but guys like Demetric Trice, guys like Brad Davison, guys like Nate Reavers, guys that have been in this program for a while, I don't necessarily know how long they're going to want to stay, considering they'll have other options, but man, you have so many veteran guys on this team, and talented vets too, and this is a Badger team that I predicted to win the Big Ten before the season started. And I understand Illinois, really good. Michigan, really good. Ohio State, really good. Iowa, really good. But I'll admit, right now, when you look at everything that's been going down with Wisconsin, they're disappointing, man. They have too many veterans to be this good, to be this bad. And they did rebound nicely on Sunday night with a win against Northwestern. But let's face it, it's Northwestern. How many points does a win over Northwestern really get you? So I think when you look at Wisconsin, they absolutely have a right to be one of the more disappointing teams in college basketball. They're going to be around a 6-7 seed by the time March Madness comes around. Will they be able to fix it before then? Who knows? But the last couple games have been disappointing. Takeaway number 7. Derek Culver is an absolute beast, and West Virginia just continues to roll. And I've been so impressed with Bob Huggins and the coaching job that he has done with this Mountaineer team so far this season. And in this game against Texas, I'll admit, I watched a lot of it. They had no business winning that game, man. They really didn't. Texas was the better team from start to finish. They dominated physically. They were really able to use their athleticism to their advantage, and still, somehow, some way, the game ends with West Virginia on top. And I was really impressed with the Mountaineers' effort. I think that they are, besides Baylor, the biggest threat in the Big 12 to make a deep tournament run. West Virginia, I'm telling you right now, is going to be a team that I'm going to pick to go far. Why? Because they're tough, they could shoot, they could play fast. Their defense has to improve a little bit, I get it, but I believe in Bob Huggins, and the fact that he brought his team on the road to Austin, Texas, coming off a loss, by the way. West Virginia lost to Texas in Morgantown earlier this season. And the fact that they had the confidence to just bounce back like that, super, super impressive. West Virginia's next game will be on Tuesday night against TCU. And here's the good news also, folks. Baylor's back this weekend. Hey, finally, it will be good to watch Baylor play in a basketball game. But West Virginia, they're going to end the season at TCU, at Baylor on the 25th. That should be a heck of a game because those two teams actually haven't even played yet. And then home against Kansas State. Takeaway number 8. Caleb Love is an absolute baller. I watched a lot of North Carolina Louisville on Saturday. And I think the Tar Heels are a team in the ACC kind of in a similar way to Duke that no one is going to want to play in the ACC tournament. Because I watched UNC against Louisville, and I understand Louisville, I'm not judging them too badly on this game. I understand they lost by 45. That's never an ideal thing. But at the same time, I think the main takeaway for me was how well UNC played. 99 points on the offensive side of the ball. How about Day'Ron Sharpe, a guy who, as all of the freshmen have blossomed this season, Day'Ron Sharpe has always been one I've kept my eye on because he's always been big and physical, and he can get the job done for UNC. Just he hasn't really been consistent in terms of his play and production, because I feel like with all of the other big men UNC has on this roster, he hasn't really gotten that big-time opportunity yet. But on Saturday, he really took advantage of an opportunity, whether it was there or not, because he had 21 points. He played awesome down the stretch. And I do think that when we look at the North Carolina Tar Heels, if Caleb Love could continue this, he only had 9 points, but prior to that game against Louisville, he'd been playing great. The game was over by crunch time, so it doesn't really matter that much that his numbers weren't that gaudy. But this is also a kid that put up 25 points against Duke. I believe in his game, even as a young point guard. I believe, actually, in this North Carolina Tar Heel squad. And by the time we hit March, I actually do think they could be a team worth keeping our eyes out on, because in a season where all of the Blue Bloods haven't had great years, a lot of people will try to categorize North Carolina in that same group. But at the same time, I don't buy that at all. They're playing some really good basketball right now. Takeaway number 9. It's super unfortunate that the Arizona Wildcats actually decided to self-impose a postseason ban for this year's NCAA tournament, because watching them on Saturday against USC, I was actually really impressed. If you haven't been following, the USC Trojans have actually been one of the more surprising teams in all of college basketball so far this season, and Arizona beat that same first place in the Pac-12 USC team by 10 plus the other night on Saturday on the road in Los Angeles. And one thing I've really noticed about Arizona is they have a top 3 that could really be trending in the right direction for that program. The top 3 of James Akinjo, Benedict Mathurin, and Tubelis, Julius Tubelis, have all been phenomenal for this Arizona team. And there have been many moments throughout the season where I said, damn, I wish Arizona didn't self-impose, ban themselves, because Sean Miller is actually doing a pretty good coaching job. And I know, of all of the people that I'm going to sit here and pretend to feel sorry for, I don't think Sean Miller is ever going to be that guy. I don't think anyone is ever going to want anyone to hear crying pity about Sean Miller. But he's done a good coaching job so far this year. And I do think in the Pac-12, a conference where over the last couple of years it's been wide open, there hasn't really been that one team that could make a legitimate deep tournament run. I'm telling you, this year, I think that team could be, or next year, I think that team could be Arizona, because they're going to have plenty of talent back. Mathurin, Tubelis, Akinjo. They also have a kid, Kerr Krieslow, another international kid. I love his game. Watch out for Arizona next year, and really towards the end of this year, because they are a good basketball team. And then finally, takeaway number 10. If I was a Minnesota Golden Gopher fan, these would be one of the time periods where I would really not be very happy with my head coach, Richard Pitino. Because throughout this whole season, I understand it's been the notion that, okay, Minnesota, they play great at home, but they can never beat anyone on the road. And I watched them against Rutgers in that game because I wanted to see, man, if you're an NCAA tournament team, right? And I think Minnesota is one, barely. But if you're an NCAA tournament team, you have to win at least one road game. That's where money is made in college basketball. Going into an opponent's gym and ripping their soul out. And unfortunately, the Minnesota Golden Gophers and their 6-10 Big Ten conference record hasn't been able to do that. All of their wins so far this season have came at home. Lost to Illinois, lost to Wisconsin on the road, lost to Michigan on the road, lost to Iowa on the road. They also lost to Purdue on the road. They also lost Gabe Kalsher, who was out with the broken finger. I think Minnesota could be a team that if they're not careful, they can maybe find their way on the bubble. Their next 4 games, home against Northwestern and at Nebraska. If you don't at a minimum go 2-0 in that stretch, that's a problem. Then you will head to Penn State. That's a game you should win, but to be honest, right now, am I confident in the Golden Gophers' ability to win that game? Probably not. And then they'll host Rutgers. So I think if you're a fan of the Minnesota Golden Gophers, you have to be a little concerned considering that your team has now lost 3 games in a row, and they haven't won a road game all season. And in order to make the NCAA tournament, I'm not saying it's going to cost Minnesota, but in normal circumstances, in order to make the tournament, just win a road game. That's all Minnesota has to do. And unfortunately, I get it, they play in a tough league, still no excuses. Win a road game if you want to make the tournament. And for Richard Pitino, I'm not saying they're going to get left out, but if they do, the only person he has to blame is himself and his team.